Voting in Texas is kind of whack.
You have to register in person.
You can't register at the polls.
Schools are supposed to register you to vote, but
Your registration can get purged.
And sometimes there aren't even polling locations near you.
You have to show an ID to prove you can vote.
and not everyone is allowed to vote by mail.
Voting in Texas is actually really inaccessible. Less than half the state's eligible voting population turns out to the polls. So what is so difficult about voting in Texas, and how does this change in a pandemic?
To vote in a Texas election, you must register at least 1 month before Election Day, and you can register on the day of the election.
If you move from your current address, you must update your voter registration.
You have to be a U.S. citizen and 18 years old by the next election, and you can't register to vote if you have a felony, unless your sentence has been fully discharged.
To get registered in Texas, you have to get registered in person by a volunteer deputy registrar.
Now, due to COVID-19, we must prioritize social distancing, which makes it harder to register to vote in person. Online voter registration would be useful during a time like this, but Texas doesn't have it.
To put it mildly, the voter registration process is complicated, worrisome, and time-consuming. Trust us, we registered over 20,000 voters in the last year.
Once you're registered, it's time to vote.
Texas has early voting periods, which start around 2 weeks before Election Day.
You do have to bring a valid ID, which can include a Texas driver's license, a Texas personal ID card, a U.S. passport, or a Texas handgun license.
But not a student ID. Interesting.
During early voting, you can usually vote at any polling location in your county. You can find your nearest polling location at the link below.
Though many of these locations are not accessible or convenient for communities of color.
Polling locations are notoriously shut down in these communities by officials, but that has a costly and discriminatory effect.
Voters face longer lines at polling places, transportation obstacles, denials of language assistance, and mass confusion about where they can cast their ballot.
It makes it harder and even impossible for many communities of color to exercise their right to vote when the nearest polling location is many miles away.
And what's about people who are elderly or have disabilities?
There is another option, mail-in voting.
If you're out of the county you registered to vote in, you can request a vote-by-mail ballot from your local elections office.
You have to fill out, sign, and mail the vote-by-mail application 11 days before election date to your county election office.
It's pretty simple and convenient for those who can use it.
And with COVID-19, many of us are wondering what Texas is going to do to ensure that we have a safe election.
Right now, Texas is facing a major problem. To vote, you have to go in person, but public gatherings are unsafe and a health risk.
We all saw what happened in Wisconsin during their primary election, and then again in Georgia.
In no other industrialized country in the world is it so difficult to vote so often.
Look at this. Line wrapped around both sides of the church.
This is so wrong. This is just so wrong. This election should have been called off. You know, they're telling us to stay in the house and, stand 6 feet from each other. But then one of the most important times, they're forcing us to come out here in a group. Stop playing politics with our lives.
But Texas leaders are still committed to voting in person.
This is not safe, but elected officials don't seem to care.
And Tucker, no one reached out to me and said, as a senior citizen, are you willing to take a chance on your survival in exchange for keeping the America that all America loves for your children and grandchildren? And if that's the exchange, I'm all in.
Voting rights advocates are trying to make the election safe. Back in April, they filed to expand votes-by-mail eligibility to allow any voter to apply under physical disability to avoid contracting COVID-19 at the polls. And they won.
But Attorney General Ken Paxton threatened that voters cannot claim the pandemic as a reason to apply for disability on their mail-in ballot, or else you can be criminally charged with fraud and receive heavy fines.
He's dragged the fight for vote-by-mail into the courts. Who knows when that'll be over.
Texans should not have to choose between their right to vote and protecting their health.
Until we get online voter registration and vote by mail for all Texans, here's what you can do. Number 1, check your registration status. Visit texasrising.org/register to check and update your voter registration details.
Sign our petition to demand online registration for all Texans.
3, get out and vote. As elections roll around, check on what steps your county is taking to make voting safe and then get out and vote.